Hannah Cusworth. Hannah Cusworth is an AHRC-funded PhD researcher working with English Heritage and the University of Hull. Her work explored the history of mahogany furniture in 3 London villas and the people who were involved in the Atlantic mahogany trade in the long 18th century. She's particularly interested in the role of West African knowledge, white women, and free people of colour in the development of that trade. Ultimately, the focus of her work is bringing the mahogany bringing the mahogany in the 3 English heritage properties into conversation with Blackness. Prior to starting her PhD, Hannah was head of history at a South London secondary school and now works as a freelance education consultant for organisations such as the BBC, National Maritime Museum, and British Film Institute. And I would add, I think the National Trust needs you on their advisory board as well. Javaria Abbasi is an MPhil candidate in Spanish at the Department of Modern and Medieval Languages at Lady Margaret Hall, University of Oxford. And her Twitter bio, amongst other things, tells me she also loves League of Legends and is a coffee aficionado. I don't imagine those will come up today, but who knows? Finally, Madeleine Foote is a DPhil student in the Faculty of History at Oxford. And she didn't mention this in her bio, and I hope she won't mind, but I think it's really important to acknowledge Madeleine's very important collaborative activism around changing Oxford's sexual assault policy. You can find out more about this work if you would like to on their Instagram or Twitter accounts or their website, Transforming Silence. I'll open the floor to the 3 of you to speak. Thank you so much.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, I'd like to begin. So my name is Javaria Abbasi. I'm a first-year DPhil in Modern Languages Spanish at the University of Oxford. So since I'm only a first year, most of what I'm going to mention about my dissertation in this presentation is obviously very theoretical. But I'd like to begin with a brief story that I think both explains nothing about my research and simultaneously explains it in its entirety. I'm a Pakistani American studying at the University of Oxford, which is for me the dual colonial heartland. My father is from a gaon, or village in Murray, which overlooks the capital of Pakistan, Islamabad, that prides itself in resisting British imperialism. My father's from a lineage with centuries of oral history passed from father to son and preserved in Bahari. It's a history that disappears with each successive generation. My paternal history is it's kind of like a history about great men, preserved by great men, in which women don't even warrant an aside, until it comes to my father's grandmother. My father's grandmother was the only woman respected enough to lead a jarga, or a kind of town hall, that united all of the adjacent gaons or villages in Murray. This was incredibly important, as the paths between the mountains were notoriously difficult to traverse, but community members who had even moved to the city would travel for hours from Islamabad to attend. I never understood why my father insisted on telling me this story, why the story about a woman I'd never met was so important for him to transmit to me. All throughout my youth, I grumbled at my father's stories, infatuated with Western philosophers and European theorists. I wondered why my father had nothing but stories. Paradoxically, I would think, it wasn't until I left home and encountered Nawa studies and Black studies as an undergraduate that I learned the value of those stories. To invoke literary critic Barbara Christian in A Race for Theory, while people of color have always theorized, quote, are theorizing, and I intentionally use the verb rather than the noun, is often in narrative forms, in the stories we create, in riddles and proverbs, in the play with language, since dynamic rather than fixed ideas seem more to our liking, end quote. In his generation, my father was the only one interested in the preservation of our history, and he has only daughters. So now, the preservation of that history falls not to his son, but to his eldest daughter, me. a woman who grew up in the United States, who can speak and understand only a broken Pahari. As an adult, I've begun to understand that the stories of my father's grandmother are the only stories of women in my family that have survived to be passed on to me. My father tells me those stories to build a connection between me and the knowledge I'm obtaining. For him, those stories were what the first Native American US poet laureate from the Muskegee Nation, Joy Harjo, calls living words. I could only truly know the oral history of my father's family if I respected it, if it resonated with me. And my father knew that his daughter had never expressed interests in the stories of great men whose wives and mothers and daughters did not even warrant a footnote. The stories my father tells me are how he expresses his radical break with centuries of sexist paternalism that excludes women from our history. They are his theory, but they are a theory constructed with the input of his listener, me. With every eye roll and groan and huff of disbelief, my father remaps our history to ensure that it has a future in me. Now, you may wonder why I just told you this story. I think first, it's because it acknowledges a little bit about my positionality, because what I'm going to now go into is another part of me, which I think is just as reflective about me as a person, just as it doesn't particularly relate to my positionality in an obvious way at first glance. That is my DPhil research. My DPhil research is in a completely different part of the world. It doesn't necessarily relate to the legacy of perhaps British imperialism, but it does relate to the history that I've just described of an oral culture. My DPhil project is a philological approach to conquest Mexican literature from 1521 to 1700 that traces the development of and resistance to the hierarchy of Españoles, Spaniards, over Indios or Indians in both maps and literary texts. It examines both Spanish and Nahuatl understandings of words that reify or challenge what I call imperial discourse. I argue that imperial discourse is an invented colonial system of meaning that often erases indigenous worldviews. This imperial discursive order, I extend Dr. Russell's research, was founded upon the mythification of conquest history. And I consider the endurance of many indigenous epistemologies in the face of this conquest as what philosopher Jose Medina terms epistemic resistance, or a contestation of mythification, symbolic stigmatizations, and imposed silences. Now, I'd like to focus on one specific aspect of my research in a literary department. That is, my decision to include indigenous maps as vehicles of knowledge with embedded narratives or stories. As I mentioned earlier, in her introduction to the anthology of First Peoples poetries, Living Nations, Living Words, Joy Harjo explains the value of what she calls map making. In her words, quote, "The map making represented by this anthology comes at a crucial time in history, a time in which the failures to acknowledge, listen to, and consider everyone when making the map of American memory has brought to us a reckoning," end quote. As a cartographer, historian, and literary scholar of early modern Mexico, I find that
Javaria, you're frozen on our end.
You're back. You're just on mute.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I disconnected for a second.
You did for a second, but not for too long.
Okay, sorry, just to back up. I think I was talking about the Uppsala map, if that's good with everyone.
Yeah, tiny bit before the map.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
You're talking about yourself as a scholar.
Okay, cool. So I believe I disconnected and I was talking a little bit about my research and literary department. Is that good for everyone? Okay. So basically, I was arguing that Harjo's words, which are included in her collection Living Nations, Living Words, talk a lot about the importance of map making. And in critical cartography, which is part of my discipline, we understand maps as windows to a curated past and present of a space, which often says a lot about the map maker's vision for the future. I was then giving the example of one such map from the colonial period of Mexico called the 1550 Uppsala map. It's a watercolor image of Mexico City in the Valley of Mexico, authored by an indigenous painter scribe, or tlaquilo, educated at the Franciscan Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco. The position of a sole Spanish figure on the border between the indigenous and Spanish quadrants of the city emphasizes a spatial dynamic, west and east, gridded and non-gridded, uniform and irregular, which maps onto a visual contrast between what is, quote, Spanish and what is, quote, indigenous. However, in the map, there's still an order to the curvilinear slabs of space circumscribed by ambulatory indigenous figures. Not only do these regions employ dual Spanish and Nahuatl toponymic inscriptions, they reproduce the pre-Hispanic limits between indigenous polities contained in what Barbara Mundi calls boundary maps. These limits represent the walked routes used to resolve border disputes prior to colonization, and they valorize glyphs and boundaries from a subordinated indigenous visual culture. This includes Nahuatl place names in glyph form from the Florentine Codex and Codex Mendoza, which would have been unintelligible to a European viewer, even one versed in the Romanized form of the language. And it indexes stories of these communities placed in their place in the Mesoamerican world, described in 16th century poems collected and transcribed by mestizos like Ximalpajín and Bautista Pomar, suggesting a possible alternative audience of his map to be fellow indigenous elites like himself. The metaphors for the American landscape emerge in colonial discourse, write literary scholars Santa Arias and Maricel Melendez, as symbolic structures that justify policies or question imperial power. As illustrated by the Uppsala map, space in colonial Spanish America was a discursive articulation, a rhetoric of power which invented the parameters for relations between the distinct groups who imagined themselves occupying it. To avoid reproducing colonial parameters in my own research to the best of my ability, I seek to move beyond what Spanish colonizers viewed as words in my philological approach and include Nahuatl glyphs and quote unquote pinturas or pictures as just as valid ways of transmitting stories as later Romanized poems. With regards to my own research, I begin by acknowledging my own positionality and that I'm not a Nahuatl. I respect that my resonance with Nahuatl cosmovision will always be limited to drawing analogies to my own experiences as a Pakistani-American descendant of a Gau from Muddy. My interpretation of Nahuatl cosmovision is thus inherently shaped by my positionality as an outsider to that community. So I cite contemporary scholars in Nahuatl studies in Mexico and native Nahuatl speakers and poems and privilege their interpretations over my own and those of more famous Western academics who are second language speakers. I also engage Nahuatl music and poetry as theory in its own right. I recognize, moreover, citations as intellectual currency in academia, so I cite work by Nahuatl descendants that is published in quote unquote lesser journals or collections in the eyes of Western academia. On my free time, or perhaps not free time, but when I'm not just being an academic, I also work as the cultural and operations officer for Dream of Darkness, a Mexican indie video game company that works to tell the indigenous side to the 16th century Spanish conquest of Mexico through consultation with Nahuatl voice actors and community members. As I create historical character portfolios for 2D and 3D artists to bring to life important figures like the indigenous interpreter Fernando Cortez, Malintzin Marina, or the Nahuatl or the Mexica deity of slaves and oathbreakers, Tezcatlipoca, or even the Tlatoani leader of Texcoco, Ixtlilxochitl II, I can ensure that my historical interpretations and findings are constantly being critiqued and evaluated on Twitter and Discord by community members outside of academia who are directly impacted by our portrayals. My research is far from perfect, and many times my team and I have had to adjust a character, like one of our Tzotzil Maya characters, based on community feedback. But I think that my work provides an important model for how I'd like my academic scholarship to look like in this new social media age, as I work in a department that doesn't have Nawa Hablantes or native Nawa speakers and doesn't have Indigenous voices represented on the faculty. I would like to think that my dissertation would grow and evolve from feedback in my field research in Mexico. This brings me to my conclusion. As this conference attempts to create a map of the past, present, and future of Indigenous studies in the United Kingdom and Europe, the question that must resound in all of our heads is how can those of us, like myself, who are non-Indigenous, continually shape a discipline that avoids replicating the critiques of post-colonial and subaltern studies? These critiques raise an important question about the purpose of this conference and our relationship to it as both speakers and listeners. Who are we? What is our positionality to the research or map that we are constructing? And who is our listener? Who is Indigenous studies for and about? To echo literary scholar Rita Felsky, the canonical status of many works, whether of literature or of research, is defined as their ability to remain relevant through different historical moments. It is the byproduct of both the continual resonance with a community of readers and institutional inertia, whereby citations generate more citations. Graduate students teach the texts they themselves were taught. Canons, whether of fiction or of theory, reproduce themselves over time. And while my fellow panelists will talk more about this notion of canon and empire, I'd like to conclude that I hope that based on what we've heard today from our many speakers about the importance of creating transnational diasporic networks led by Native peoples, those of us with systemic and institutional privileges can work to write grants to get Native speakers to our institutions, to cite their work and add them to reading lists of courses we are teaching, to take the time to actually write positive evaluations for Indigenous faculty members who are instructors, and invest our time in community-based initiatives outside of academia. Because the reproductions of canon and problematic mythologized history, as noted by Mr. Perry, is much more widespread than just academia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go next and I'm going to share my screen. So I'll just give me a second. So yeah, I'm Hannah Cusworth. Thank you so much for having me today and for this panel. I'm going to talk a bit about my research I work on these three houses really, or at least I take them as like the jumping off point for my research, which is all about mahogany furniture, as you can just about see here, like a chest of drawers. And then sometimes in one of the houses that I work in, the mahogany is actually in the like structure of the house. So it's in the floorboards, it's in the staircases. And I was really attracted to this project. Oh, this is just a little bit about me. So as you can probably tell, like I'm a sort of, I don't know how I would describe myself. I'm like a mixed race, like Black Brit. And that is really important to why I decided to do this project on mahogany. Like I used to be a secondary school teacher and I just saw the project on Twitter and it absolutely fascinated me. And lots of you probably know where mahogany comes from, but it's even though it's seen as like really quintessentially English, it's actually from the Caribbean. The stuff that we see in houses like this is primarily from Jamaica and then from other parts of the Caribbean, in the British case, particularly from what is now Belize. And so for me, mahogany seemed like this example of like Blackness in plain sight in Britain and in kind of elite British institutions. And I think the more I was finding out about history as a secondary school teacher, the more I realized that this is the case for so many different parts of British life. If you're thinking about, for example, like the British Museum and how Hans Sloane and his kind of voyage to Jamaica was such a central part of his collections. And then that's such a central part of the British Museum, the British Library, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I was really drawn to this project about mahogany. A huge part of it was really about kind of my personal history there with my dad on one side and with my mum and my sister and my wedding on the other side. And so before I started the PhD, like I said, I just saw the advert for it on Twitter, and I think maybe unlike some other people's PhDs where like you go with a proposal, for mine the funding was already there and the project was already made, and I almost kind of applied for it like a job. And so the title of it was Mahogany, Enslaved Africans, Mosquito Indigenous People at Chiswick House, Kenwood and Marble Hill. And as I said, I was at that point when I was applying, I was a secondary school teacher and I'd been out of education for quite a while, like 10 years, but I was becoming really fascinated with Black British history, but also about the Atlantic world. And lots of people have mentioned like how bad the curriculum is in the UK. And I was doing some work to try and think about how can we teach a better history of empire, British colonialism, the Atlantic world. And some of the books that I was reading was really helping me to do that. And one of the books that I was just completely captivated by was Fifth Son by Camilla Townsend. And I think I heard about it because it won a book prize. And I think for me, it was so powerful because it gave me this complete other understanding of Indigenous history, very different to what my understanding of it was, which, and I'm going to give a little bit of a warning because I think the next slide that I show is like curriculum materials from like the British curriculum or like textbooks. But as Tony was saying, like the way that we teach Indigenous history in Britain is like pre-trash. And so I won't dwell on it for too long, but like this was kind of my understanding of what Indigenous history was. And it was all through this lens of like the American West, which is what the topic is called here. And I actually didn't teach this as a teacher at any of my schools, but it is really common. And my understanding is that this topic came about in about the 1970s in Britain, when there was like a real fear that history wasn't seen as being like relevant to pupils. And so what was decided was that like kids enjoy cowboy and Indian films, right? So let's do something about the history of that in the classroom. But as you all know and can appreciate, like if that's the framing, if that's what you're going in as, the framing of it is this kind of cowboy and Indians vibe, like that is obviously incredibly problematic, right? And so much of it is framed in this idea of, you know, what's like a both sides of the argument kind of vibe, right? Like what's the reasons for this tension between settlers and native people, and also this idea of this kind of this extermination and this death, and that there are no longer Indigenous people who exist or who are, you know, thriving despite the genocide and the colonialism. And so things like Fifth Son kind of really opened my eyes. And I also tried to do a little bit of work during the pandemic. There was this thing called Oak Academy that started up, and I was involved in it and tried to do a bit of work of like trying to provide kids with some of the earlier history so that they had a bit of context, because I think quite often you just like jump in straight at the American West with no early context of British colonialism, of how, you know, what we now call America was a place that actually, well, first wasn't called that, and second, you know, there was hundreds of different Indigenous nations that existed beforehand. So I was intrigued by the project, mostly from like a Black history perspective, but was also really keen to see like how the Indigenous element of the project, how I could kind of get involved in that, and how I could kind of, yeah, maybe try and do a little bit of Indigenous history that I could share with people who are coming to these houses, you know, like Marble Hill, coming to the houses, seeing the mahogany, and maybe start to nuance and teach some of that complex history to some of the visitors, and think about the kind of Indigenous involvement in the mahogany trade. And the research group that my PhD is attached to kind of specializes in Indigenous histories, and they're called treated spaces. So I felt like this was a really important part of the project for me to focus on, as well as the sort of histories of enslavement and kind of like Black histories that were central to the project too. And so when I started the project, I was really conceiving of through this question of like who was involved in the 18th century mahogany trade, and all of these different groups of people. So white women, like this here is Henrietta Howard, who was the woman who built Marble Hill House with the mahogany staircase and floorboards. But white women have really been left out of the traditional literature about the mahogany trade. It's very much been about men, about free people of color, about enslaved Africans, and their knowledge as opposed to just their labor in felling the mahogany. But also of course, like Indigenous people, and then thinking about the kind of actual people who go and visit the house, you know, visit the houses now, like to what sense are people today involved in the mahogany trade as like viewers of the 18th century furniture. So I went to the secondary literature and started to try and find out a little bit what has been written before about Indigenous involvement in the mahogany trade. And the focus really, when we're thinking about Indigenous peoples, was on this the Mosquito who live today primarily in Honduras and Nicaragua. And there was a few mentions here and there, like this kind of sense of, oh, there was cooperation with Indigenous people, and that Indigenous people maybe served as like brokers. But when I then tried to find out further information about, you know, in what way was there this kind of forest reconnaissance, or like to what extent, like how did that trade work? Actually, there was very little information in the secondary literature. And going into starting to have a little look in the archives as well, there wasn't a huge amount there. Now, I think from being someone who researches Black British history, you know that because something isn't immediately obvious in the archives, it doesn't mean it didn't happen, or that you just maybe need to think a little bit more creatively about the archive. Like, as we all know, like the archive isn't neutral and it doesn't provide us with everything that we want to know, especially when we're looking at Black or Indigenous histories. But there was something that was kind of jumping out to me as a bit of a problem, which is that when I'm thinking about the mahogany trade, I'm really thinking about Jamaica and then what is now Belize. Whereas if this is a map of the kind of current like geography of Mosquito speakers, and as you can see, it's much more centered around Honduras and Nicaragua. There was definitely British kind of colonial activity in these areas, and there was also mahogany felling. But it wasn't really the place that I was wanting to focus my research on. And it is definitely the case that kind of Mosquito people worked to some extent in collaboration with the British and moved up to Belize and did wood cutting there. But I think I started to have some anxieties around, like, to what extent am I trying to shoehorn this in because it's written in the project description, and to what extent is it actually kind of almost like a faithful representation, I guess, of the history that I am looking at when I'm thinking about Belize, when I'm thinking about Jamaica. And then, as I'm sure all of you know, people are always like, don't just like quote to T.Y. Smith, which that's exactly what I'm doing here. But I think it was like her book was very much like a way in for me to think about, well, what are Indigenous people actually saying about research and researcher ethics? Because this was something that I was starting to feel was like a bit of a concern for me. Like, it's not, Indigenous studies isn't something that I have a background in, but as soon as I was starting to like read a little bit, I could feel that like there were a lot of ethical issues that I really needed to be aware of. And this obviously comes from how people in the West, in Britain, in America, white settler like researchers have treated Indigenous people. And I felt like that was something that I really needed to be aware of. And it's in the literature, but it's also things that people are talking about like on Twitter today about like how is there any ethical way for non-Indigenous people to do this research, right? To research about Indigenous communities, and that, you know, there's this kind of been this explosion in non-Indigenous people trying to integrate Indigenous knowledge, but without really thinking through the ethics. And that was something that was starting to really play on my mind. So at one point I raised some of these concerns with people involved in my project, and I also raised some concerns about being a Black British researcher, and a lot of the secondary literature that I was reading, some of it was from, you know, a few decades ago, and the language was pretty, you know, it wasn't language that we would use today to describe Black people. And I think I knew that maybe doing the source work was going to be quite hard, like being in the archive. I just didn't expect how hard it was also going to be to read the secondary literature, and, you know, Black people being described, you know, as Negroes, and reading that again and again and again. So I was kind of bringing up some of this about how it was the kind of emotional impact it was having on me. And I was kind of told, like, you know, well, this project is mostly about Indigenous people and the environment. It's not really about it's not really so much about slavery, and, you know, you're not Indigenous, so I don't really know why this is kind of affecting you in the way that it is. And I kind of sat with that for quite a while, and I thought quite a lot about that, because yeah, like, it's completely the case, you know, I'm not Indigenous, but I think it was starting to, these kind of almost like questions around ethics and kind of politics and recognition of like the harms that have been done both to the Black and Indigenous communities was really starting to weigh heavily on me. And a way that I kind of came out of that like real low was by becoming involved in sort of Black studies and starting to read literature from Black studies authors, particularly Saidiya Hartman and Christina Sharp and Tina Campt. And just those scholars gave me a way to talk about how I was feeling, and gave me that kind of language. And I felt like this was a way forward for me to be able to almost like survive in the academy, because I was kind of increasingly feeling like maybe this was like the academy wasn't necessarily a place for me. And going then into their work opened up this whole world, which I don't think I knew existed, all of this scholarship of just incredible scholars from, I don't think, I guess I'd obviously heard of like people like Stuart Hall, but, you know, I hadn't heard of people like Catherine McKittrick or Sylvia Winter, and they've become really central to the work that I am doing. And so in terms of the now, this is what my project is really focused on, and that's what Emma said about bringing kind of mahogany in these houses into conversation with Blackness. And that's really my focus, like using Black studies literature to really analyze the mahogany and to think about, when I'm in the archives, you know, what am I seeing? How am I interpreting that archival information? And I think that kind of the more I read and the more I started to like, I guess, to be like less apologetic about my Blackness, right? And to really like embrace it and to really engage with it from a personal and scholarly perspective, the more I started to see that, I think especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter, there was this explosion of scholarship about Black people and about Blackness that I was seeing all over the academy, and people were winning grants left, right and center to do studies about Black people. And very often the scholars weren't Black. And I was starting to get really vexed by this. There was just something about it that didn't feel right to me. And so often these scholars were doing research projects about Black life, but they weren't talking about why they came to this work. And they weren't talking about their positionality or really engaging with that. And that was, when I was seeing that, I was getting increasingly like vexed by it. And it made me think that, you know, there's actually a lot of parallels here, right? There's a lot of parallels here between how I was feeling about non-Black scholars being like greedy in effect, right? And wanting to know and wanting to take from Black life, whether it was in the past, in the archives, or in the present by kind of more like social sciences research projects. And I see that in people talking on Twitter about this idea of, you know, how people are trying to take Indigenous knowledge and to use it to further their career effectively in the academy often, and not really thinking very carefully about the ethics behind this, why they're doing this work, who is it serving? Like, as Javaria was saying, like, who is it for, right? Like, if you haven't done this in collaboration, I'm so sorry if you can hear my dogs going mad outside. If you haven't done this in collaboration with Indigenous communities, and these questions haven't come from Indigenous communities, and these projects haven't, like, really, who are you doing it for? Like, you're doing it kind of for yourself, right? And for the Western Academy. And to me, that just doesn't feel cool. So obviously there are people who are working on this, thinking again about the crossover or the kind of the synergies and how Black studies and Native studies, how they speak with each other. Obviously, you know, Tiffany King's work is incredibly important here, and it's something that I'm taking a lot from. But I think it's also interesting to think about that this is in the North American context, and that is not where I'm working. And there's obviously more people and more scholars and literature that I need to find. And I think there's this also thing here that's also about, look, the liberatory task Catherine McKittrick talks about, it's not to like measure unfreedom and to like describe it, but it's actually to try and like move forward from it and see it as like this intellectual site that can tell us something new. And I think that's something that I'm really trying to work out, like, how am I bringing that into it, rather than just seeing the history that I'm doing as like describing and telling, which obviously McKittrick talks about. It's like, that's not liberatory, right? So to end and think about my research in the future, I guess one of my conclusions is that, like, I don't know, right? I don't know what the answer is here. And I think that I feel increasingly okay with that actually I don't know the best way to do this. And that maybe it's also really important for me in my work to properly narrate that. Because so often that's hidden, right? In the scholarship that we read, we don't hear about people trying to work through these really important ethical issues around how we do scholarship that doesn't harm people, how we do scholarship about people who aren't us, in a way that is liberatory. But I also feel like just ignoring, avoiding, excluding Indigenous people from my research totally, it doesn't feel like the answer. It feels like perpetuating these silences which have existed in the past. But nor do sort of traditional approaches born from colonialism, the sort of traditional archival work that we do as historians, that also doesn't feel like a way to solve these kind of issues I've been having. And so I guess from here, from Christina Sharp, this idea of like, we must become undisciplined. And for me, Black Studies has really taught me that we don't have to stick to one discipline, that you can bring things in from a whole variety of different disciplines. And in my work, I'm thinking about how I might use autoethnography to start talking about some of these kind of ethical things that I'm working through. And that's not traditional to history, but I feel like it's important, and potentially there's a liberatory potential for that methodology. And also just, I guess, questioning, as Javaria was talking about, like, what is knowledge? What's seen as valid knowledge? Who is seen as a producer of valid knowledge? And then finally, to end, I think for me, it's also thinking about, well, what can I actually contribute? Like, how much influence do I have in the organizations that I work with, university or within heritage, to think about, right, if we're going to do this, let's do this properly, right? Like, are you interested in doing this properly? That means really long-term collaborations. That means funding. That means bringing scholars, from Central America over here. Like, what role can I play in starting to maybe agitate for some of that change? And also what information that I have privileged access to, whether it's access to archives or libraries, that I can try and make more openly available, more open access. So thinking about what my role is, and it might not be writing like a traditional history, it might be contributing in other, maybe more subversive ways. So thank you so much for listening, and I will pass over to Madeleine, who I think if I just stop sharing, you should be able to share your screen.
Thank you, Hannah. That was incredible. My name is Madeleine. I work predominantly on Angolan history, and today I'm going to look at how African history intersects with some Indigenous studies approaches. And you'll notice that there's a lot of overlap between my presentation and Hannah's, which makes a lot of sense because we proposed this panel with Javaria all together. I came to this work initially because I used to work for National Geographic. And as part of my job, at some point, I went to Angola, which, for those who don't know, fairly large country, about twice the size of Texas, on the western coast of Africa. It's Portuguese speaking. And its history is a lot longer than its history with colonialism, rather, not its general history, is longer than in many other places in Africa. It was colonized by the Portuguese starting in 1482, a decade before Columbus's journey to North America. And my research specifically looks at sort of the center and the east of the country, which is sometimes referred to as the Angolan Highlands, and the provinces of Bié, Mashiko, and Quando Cubango. My research and my interests especially lie in Mashiko, which is an internal region that, despite the very long history of colonialism in Angola, was very resistant to colonial oversight. And, in sort of like practical terms, really wasn't under any sort of colonial control until the mid-20th century. So it was a very, very brief encounter with colonialism, formal colonialism. As a consequence of this, it is very poorly documented in the archive, which, as Hannah gestured towards, is not an excuse for not taking that history really seriously. In fact, in many ways, I would argue that means it's all the more urgent to work on that history, precisely because it managed to exist outside of the colonial archive and outside of colonial control for so long. But because it is not well documented in the archives, I rely really heavily on oral histories. And so I want to talk a little bit about oral histories and how that literature has come to be and how we might think about it in new terms with Indigenous studies approaches. A lot of Western histories that use oral history within them about Africa are extremely skeptical about the value of oral history. The methods for collecting oral histories, as outlined in a lot of the foundational texts for African history, split oral histories, and I put a little diagram in there, into sort of Western constructed categories before extracting what Western researchers consider valuable from them. In other words, oral histories are dissected according to Western disciplinary objectives, and researchers then either choose to set aside or ignore anything that is perceived as sufficiently useful for their ends. Once these discovered, disaggregated pieces of information from oral history are taken out of their original context, they are then fit into Western ways of knowing or compared and triangulated with Western knowledge. In other words, African knowledge that is transmitted through oral history is present in Western research in a way that secures and legitimizes and more effectively reproduces Western academic norms and epistemologies. This creates an illusion that African knowledge is being placed on par with Western knowledge because we're doing oral history, but really this oral history is being subjected to Western epistemological norms that are positioned as atemporal, neutral, and universal. This in turn obscures the ideological foundations of Western knowledge creation and discursively reinforces a Western hierarchy of knowledge. Finally, research that is produced around African oral histories is largely destined for the consumption by people other than those whose culture generated this knowledge. It creates narratives and explanations which ignore cultural preferences for representation and locates the debate about African history within an academic domain that is dominated by Western educated elites. When these methods, agendas, and questions around research mirror the priorities of a Western academy, the benefits of any knowledge creation tends to accrue to the researcher. Very much what Hannah mentioned when she said, the growing attention that gets people grants, get people funding, gets people a lot of visibility to sort of study topics that are very hot, but those benefits tend to only be reflected on the people who are doing the research and not the people who are the subject of that research. As a rule, which is true, and has been mentioned a few times today, most communities are not even able to access the research that's produced about them because of paywalls and because of journal costs, and are generally not consulted about how they're being represented to the world. Most importantly of all, in my view, is that this approach to African oral history that's sort of very, very mainstream within the historical discipline situates the value of African knowledge as only being realized by those who bring it into the Western academic framework, and it is not considered valuable when it's in its original context and under the control of the people who generate that knowledge. So given this background, it would make a lot of sense why Indigenous studies approaches to oral history and to Indigenous knowledge might be a helpful starting point to rethink how you might carry out research within a different paradigm that resists a lot of those tendencies that I just described. However, I've spent, almost 2 years pretty mystified about why so little material on Africa is present within Indigenous studies texts, and why there's very little engagement with Indigenous studies from scholars working on the continent. These two questions have become pretty central to my thesis in terms of trying to understand not just what knowledge might be produced about Angola, but more importantly, like how might we produce it in a way that doesn't reproduce harmful and colonial extractive practices. To be fair, there are exceptions to some of these absolutes. There are definitely some literature that crosses that citational engagement gap between Indigenous studies methodologies and research in an African context, and my research is very indebted to them. But they are a very small part of both research on Africa and Indigenous studies research. It's overwhelmingly the case that there is very little intellectual crossover between these two sets of literatures. And I don't have a complete answer as to why. It's something that I'm still exploring and trying to understand some of those dynamics. But like Hannah, a big part of what got me out of my funk in trying to figure out how to ethically engage in oral history research, as well as positioning myself in a way that undermined power dynamics that were really typical in the field. I found a lot of insight within Black studies and a lot of the same authors that she mentioned. Black studies has had for a while now a really beautiful and extended discussion on disciplinarity and how discipline can be a form and function of imperialism. Initially, I saw this scholarship as a way to think through the way that colonialism shaped the treatment of oral history and African knowledge. As Catherine McKittrick writes, the splitting and differentiation of ways of knowledge is in part the function of empire. Discipline is empire. Disciplinarity was often the excuse to treat African knowledge as an object of research, allowing it to be commodified by Western scholars. It was the rationale for oral histories being dissected by researchers and treated as objects to be subsumed by Western historians and consumed by a Western academic audience, commodified for the benefit of researchers' careers. As Tao Lee Goff has written, Black thought has become a resource for the humanities as Black bodies were for the sciences. Beyond Goff's point, which I think is a very powerful one, drawing parallels between colonial science and present-day research on colonialism, I have come to see extractivist practices in research to have innumerable parallels to the history of colonial resource extraction and labor exploitation in Africa. Just as colonial capitalism enriched Western economies through things like the mahogany trade, through exploitation of the Nawa and of Central America, so too has colonial research practices enriched Western scholars, creating careers, winning grants, and imbuing Western researchers with authority to speak about or on behalf of African communities. These insights from Black studies has made that gap in citation engagement between Indigenous studies and research in Africa clearer as well. There seemed like there should be a natural affinity for identifying the colonial logic within the academy and to seek new approaches which didn't reproduce colonial power dynamics and resisted Western appropriation of Indigenous knowledge. That gap, well, as I said, I don't have a full explanation for why it resulted within the development of multiple disciplines. It has become, diagnosing the problem has become easier when engaging with the Black studies kind of discussion on disciplinarity. And I now have come to believe that the colonial approach to African knowledge is a product of the same mechanism that isolates Indigenous studies approaches and literature from anti-colonial approaches and research into African knowledge systems. In other words, a colonial hierarchy of knowledge which drives extractivism and the disaggregation of African knowledge is also a taxonomy which has separated African knowledge and research from Indigenous studies. Colonial approaches to African oral histories have dissected it for parts and separated these approaches and refused to learn from and engage with Indigenous studies approaches. My very modest attempt to contribute to this panel is to ask what would happen if African scholarship engaged more with Indigenous studies and push us all to consider what Indigenous studies might gain from including more African Indigenous peoples, theorists, and work in the assessment of topics like settler colonialism, anti-colonial resistance, and decolonization. I think Sylvia Winters said it best when she wrote that the structures of a global world system are most visible to us when we engage with the cosmologies and epistemologies of a wide range of formerly globally subordinated peoples. For me, I know my understanding of Angolan history has been considerably enriched by reading scholars like Linda Tahawai-Smith, Margaret Kovac, Sean Wilson, and others who were sort of like big mainstays in sort of like oral history work within Indigenous studies. And I hope to engage them in research of oral histories in Mexico. But more importantly, I'm really optimistic about what might happen if more of us engage more broadly with the insights of Indigenous studies and how that intersects with research, both with African history, but more broadly within Africa in the future.